Turn to Grace Slick, one of the lead vocalists for the band Jefferson Airplane. While Bob Dylan or John Lennon or even Jimi Hendrix were more openly critiquing the Vietnam War, other artists like Jefferson Airplane subverted the mainstream culture by presenting a counterculture, in this case through psychedelic rock. Now, psychedelic rock musically primarily draws on blues traditions and folk rock traditions, but in terms of their lyrics and subject matter, were more strongly associated with drug use and drug culture, as well as hippie themes such as the free love movement, such as in Jefferson Airplane's song Need Somebody to Love. The band's song White Rabbit is a famous one that is based on the story of Alice in Wonderland. There's an abundance of psychedelic imagery, perhaps suggesting drug use, such as the lyrics of some mushrooms. One mushroom makes you taller, the other mushroom makes you smaller. However, in her commentary, Grace Slick had cited instead the meaning of these mushrooms and of the story as being that of courage or curiosity, following the lesser trodden path, and a general anti-establishment sentiment. She also noticed that many songs use such poetic imagery that's not necessarily as literal as the mushrooms being drugs. So Slick tended to downplay the drug use themes in White Rabbit. However, in 1969, President Nixon's war on drugs began. And this brought a lot of political scrutiny towards the psychedelic rock movement and the hippie counterculture in general. Now, the song White Rabbit especially was cited as an example of drug use in popular music. The Vice President Spiro Agnew blasts White Rabbit specifically, along with I Get High with a Little Help from My Friends by the Beatles, at a Republican fundraising dinner. They were joined in their critique by the famous broadcast personality, Art Linkletter. And because of this joint attack on psychedelic rock and drug counterculture, psychedelic music greatly waned into the 1970s. Starting from 1970, in fact, under a great deal of political pressure and petitions from listeners asking these songs not to be played, radio stations began to ban White Rabbit and I Get High with a Little Help from My Friends, and other such songs that had psychedelic overtones, such as Jimi Hendrix's Purple Haze. So I like to highlight Grace Slick as significant, not only as a female rock artist during this time, but also for the way that her music engaged in this countercultural subversion, especially at a time where there was great pushback against psychedelic drug culture. And finally, last but certainly not least, we have Marvin Gaye. In the early 1960s, Marvin Gaye got his career started as a Motown's record star, so we could have covered him earlier in the course. However, I wanted to cover him here specifically for his album What's Going On, and how that contributes to the idea of protest music. Now, Marvin Gaye was a mentor to Stevie Wonder, and Stevie Wonder looked up to Marvin Gaye. So we covered Stevie Wonder last week, and now this is making that connection. After Gaye's regular collaborator Tammy Terrell died suddenly and tragically, this forced a shift in Gaye's artistic trajectory and subject matter within his music. You may know their collaboration Ain't No Mountain High Enough, which has an overall uplifting and bright tone. This is, however, very different from the album What's Going On. Marvin Gaye conceived the album based on his brother's return from fighting in the Vietnam War, and seeing how it impacted his brother and all those around him, including the cities and the communities in which he lived. The album and the single are an introspective summary of all this unrest, social unrest, and political protest in the late 1960s. So in other words, this activated Marvin Gaye as a politically interested and commentating artist. Now, Motown Records founder Berry Gordy Jr. refused to produce the record at first. This is because he said Motown Records didn't do political commentary or social protest. He thought that it was too risky and that it would ruin his artists' careers that way. So instead, much like Stevie Wonder later did, Gaye chose to self-produce the album, producing the single, which became incredibly influential. Now what happened is, because of the success of the single, this basically forced Berry Gordy's hand into saying, okay, yes, you can produce this album yourself at Motown Records, and so that way he kept Gaye's association with Motown Records. If you hear parallels to last week's material here, you would be correct, because Marvin Gaye's self-actualization in gaining creative control for What's Going On later enabled Stevie Wonder's own creative control crusade just a few years later. What's Going On is one of the most influential and impactful albums in rock music history. We can think of it as an early predecessor of the concept album, that is, an album in this case based around different types of protest songs. For example, we have Mercy Mercy Me, which is about environmentalism, What's Going On, which protests the Vietnam War and also police brutality involved in the civil rights movement. And then also Inner City Blues, which speaks of urban discrimination and redlining, economic injustice and inequity, especially faced by Black Americans. So this album has lasting influence of protest in rock and roll, hip-hop, and rap, all these genres which now become highly socially active, but Marvin Gaye was one of the first and most powerful voices to have done it. But when talking about glam rock, the undisputed ruler has to be David Bowie. Now, David Bowie is inspired by his experience in the performing arts, especially in doing kabuki theater, which is a Japanese art form. Now, David Bowie in his presentations exemplified gender play, such as appearing on the cover of a magazine sort of in a more androgynous or even feminine presentation. David Bowie's 1972 album, The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars, is a landmark, and why I posted it on the opening slide. In this album, Bowie's assumed persona, Ziggy Stardust, is someone who's basically a messianic figure, an extraterrestrial who's coming to Earth, to the world, when the world that he's coming to only has 5 years left to live. Now, as is a common trope in other bands such as the Beatles, Ziggy Stardust comes as this rock star and spreading a message of peace and love, and rediscovering or reintroducing the power of rock music to the world that has forgotten it. That's another theme that you see in other concept albums such as 2112. However, Ziggy Stardust ultimately self-destructs under the force of his own passion and the weight of his own persona, just unable to support that. And so he becomes a parable for the fate of many rock stars, including in some ways David Bowie. We can also see this as analogous to the glam rock genre as a whole, which burned brightly for maybe 5, no more than 10 years, but ultimately sort of burned itself out in a blaze of glory, although its influences remained. So glam rock in its own way emphasized rock as an art form, a performing art form. But as in so much of theater, there's this theme of ephemerality, the fact that it's only temporary and only to be seen for a limited time. And so this ephemerality of art, so goes the readings that many have done of the album, is why Ziggy Stardust must ultimately die within the course of the album. Now, like Freddie Mercury, David Bowie incorporated a wide range of musical styles, and this is because his music, and glam rock in general, is defined more by the look rather than the sound. So as an artist, he could be versatile and sculpt his sound in different ways to match the story at hand. Now, David Bowie and Ziggy Stardust, as well as glam rock in general, helped to advance music as a storytelling medium that could portray sophisticated messages. Granted, not as complex as the level of prog rock and things like 2112, but in their own way. Like when you listen to the Ziggy Stardust album, I think incorporating quite a bit more complexity than just a series of catchy songs. But if there's anything that's true in the history of popular music, it's that the center, the status quo, cannot ultimately hold. We see a pendulum back and forth, particularly between simplicity and complexity, and we'll see this play out in different ways over the next few decades. That's going to do it for today's Soundbites video, but I think it sets you up well to engage with the rest of this week's assigned materials, whether it looks at Bob Dylan or John Lennon, the Woodstock Music Festival, or Marvin Gaye. So, I hope you have a good time engaging in those materials, and I will sign off and say bye-bye for now.